What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back. As always, thank you for joining me. My name is Paul Brettel. Today we're here to discuss Packers free agency, specifically a look at the offensive line and what's ahead for the wide receiver and defensive line position groups, two positions that the Packers have not added to at this time. But first, you know what to do. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work over at ESPNlacrosse.com. And my Wisconsin sports radio fans, Packers, Brewers, Bucks, Badgers, whatever you need, download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. So like I said, we're going to take kind of a 30,000-foot view of the Packers free agency so far. In the last video, we dove into the specific additions of Aaron Banks as well as Nate Hobbs at cornerback. So for those specific details, head back to the previous video to take a look at all that. But what I wanted to focus on today, again, before we get to the wide receiver and defensive line needs that certainly still exist, I wanted to talk about the offensive line and specifically how there is now a pretty significant expectation that the play of this group is going to improve this season. So why do I say that? Just look at the contract difference between what the Packers gave Aaron Banks versus what the New York Jets gave to Josh Myers, who over the cap just put out the contract numbers. It's a one-year deal for $2 million. That is it. So the Packers, obviously, if they wanted Josh Myers back, they very well could have and saved a lot more money than going out and signing Aaron Banks. So they clearly believe, well, one, addressing the offensive line was very much a priority for them this offseason, and two, that Aaron Banks is a significant upgrade to the collective offensive line unit because they do play different positions, but that the collective offensive line unit play is going to be significantly better. That's now the expectation for this group, and that's a big expectation given that it's not as if the Packers offensive line unit was bad at all last season. I mean, Brian Gutekunst said after the season ended, he thought for the most part pass protection, that group held up really well throughout the year. And the numbers, PFF's numbers, ESPN's pass rush win rate numbers, they all show that as well. The Packers had one of the better pass blocking offensive line units in football. The run game, Josh Jacobs, they relied heavily on him to lead them to victory. The run game being the catalyst oftentimes for the offense's overall success last season. Again, Jacobs highly productive. So it's not as if the offensive line play struggled last year. That isn't the case whatsoever. Now, is there improvement that can be had? Absolutely. Do I think that adding Aaron Banks to this Packers offensive line unit versus Josh Myers makes them better? I do. Without even seeing how things are going to play out on the field, I do think that this offensive line unit is better. But the question is it $74 million better? Because that's the difference in contract values between Aaron Banks and Josh Myers. And now I know, especially with Aaron Banks' deal, 4 years, $77 million, there's some built-in fluff in there, right? What are the odds that he's going to end up getting all, being here for the 4 years, getting all $77 million of those dollars, right? That's one of the questions at hand. But even if we break it down from just a salary cap perspective here in 2025, Josh Myers, again, playing in New York on a 1 year, $2 million deal. Let's call his cap hit this year $2 million. Aaron Banks' cap hit this year is $9 million. That's a difference of $7 million in salary cap space. And in terms of cap hit versus contract value, that's a pretty good player that the Packers are now not signing because they opted to go with Aaron Banks over Josh Myers. If a player has a $7 million cap hit, realistically, from an average annual value metric, they might be in the $12, $13, $14 million per year range, depending on what their position group is. That's a good player. That's a player that you expect to come in and make an impact. The Packers passed on that to bring in Aaron Banks, even from a guaranteed money perspective. Aaron Banks is getting $27 million in a signing bonus compared to Josh Myers' $2 million total deal that he's getting this season. And as we look ahead to 2026, Aaron Banks' cap hit goes from $9 million this year to $24 million this year. So again, is adding Aaron Banks to this offense line, is this group better today than it was last year? I do believe so. The question is, how much better is this group going to be? And when it comes to areas of improvement, I think the Banks addition helps in two specific areas. One, the depth and flexibility of this group. With Aaron Banks coming in at left guard, you now have your new starting center in Elgton Jenkins, and I think that frees up the Packers to explore where they want to utilize Jordan Morgan more, right? He could continue to play at right guard, compete with Sean Ryan for that playing time, or I think there's a greater opportunity now available to have Morgan potentially compete at left tackle with Rasheed Walker. And regardless of how that shakes out between Morgan and those two position groups, you're going to have one of either Morgan, Ryan, or Rasheed Walker potentially, if they explore that competition path at left tackle, are going to be on the bench. So your depth has improved, right? In addition to that, I think the addition of Banks is going to improve the Packers' run blocking ability and therefore their running game. And oftentimes when you have a really, really good explosive run game to lean on, your offense as a whole, the passing game, is going to be better as well. Well, we just talked about and we saw with our eyes all last year, Packers' run game was very effective. But if there's an area for improvement, we've talked about it here before, it's generating those big plays. In terms of breakaway percentage, a metric from Pro Football Focus, how often is the running back generating runs of 15 or more yards? Josh Jacobs last year ranked 32nd. Of his total yards last season, 75% of it came after contact. For some context, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, they were in the 50-55% range in terms of yards after contact. So how do you get more big runs from your running back? You help him get to the second level. There's less defenders for him to make miss at the line of scrimmage. So I think the addition of Banks can absolutely help in that regard. But again, when we look at the salary cap difference, the contract difference between Josh Myers and what Aaron Banks is getting this year, again, from an offensive line unit, not to say there isn't room for improvement. We just discussed that there is. Not to say that Aaron Banks doesn't make this group better. I think he does. But how much better? Because the contract value, the contract difference between the two says that this offensive line play should improve, take a big, big step forward when we're looking at what the Packers passed on, again, from an offensive line unit that was solid last year to what they're going for this year. So we're not going to have the answer to that question, of course, until we start to see how the 2024 season plays out. But after seeing Banks' contract, after seeing what Josh Myers got, looking at the offensive line play last year, looking at areas of opportunity, that's the big question I have right now. How much better will this offensive line unit be? All right, now let's talk about the defensive line and the wide receiver position. Obviously, two positions that could use some additions from the Packers, but we are now about 5 days into free agency, and no additions have been made. I was asked recently, am I surprised? Am I surprised that the Packers haven't signed a receiver? Am I surprised that they haven't signed a defensive lineman? And if you tune into these videos regularly, if you read my work regularly over at ESPNlacrosse.com, you already know that answer. I'm not surprised. I've said from the start, the most realistic path for the Packers to bolster these two position groups, I thought was always going to be the draft. Now, perhaps we see a short-term, middle tier type of addition in free agency at each of those position groups. But in terms of the high impact presence that the Packers, I assume, are hoping to find and add to that position, I think it always made the most sense that it was going to come in the draft. When it comes to the receiver position, finding that true established number one target who's going to come in and be that guy from day one, that was never a clear path, right? For one, there's just not a lot of those players out there. And two, if we look at bringing in that player via trade, we've talked about it here before, there's so many additional factors in play, as Brian Gutekunst talked about. It's not just, all right, hey, we'll send away a second-round pick and get this player in return. When you're sending away a draft pick, you're now losing out on a young, ascending player on an inexpensive rookie deal who's hopefully heading towards their prime football years that you're trying to capture on your football team, right? In addition to that, you're now taking on a big contract with an older player, and you probably have to extend them. That's usually the contract environment that these trades find themselves in. So you're losing out on an inexpensive deal, a young ascending player. You're taking on a big contract that now has to be put onto your books and fit into your salary cap plan that you've had, right? The 2-3 year window that a lot of general managers typically look through when evaluating their roster and salary cap situation. You have to put this massive contract on the books. And what's the trickle down effect of that? What positions might you not be able to address? What players already on your team who are coming up for new contracts do you potentially have to consider maybe we can't keep them anymore, right? Massive trickle down effect from that. And it's a big reason why we haven't seen the Packers really explore that opportunity under Brian Gutekunst. From how he wants to build out the roster, those two elements just do not work together. And right or wrong, again, that's a different conversation than what we're having. The reality is that's part of the Packers' decision-making process, and it carries a lot of weight. Same thing with bringing in a Davante Adams as well. Right or wrong, Packers typically, especially at a wide receiver position, they're not going to hand out those larger contracts, even if it is a shorter-term deal like Davante signed with the Rams, for players over 30 years old. So again, not saying that there shouldn't be some flexibility on Brian Gutekunst's part. Not saying that whatsoever. But the reality is, generally from a roster-building approach, how the Packers go about things, and we have to be mindful of that, right? So adding that type of player to this offense, again, the path to doing so just never seemed to be in play. So how does this group improve in 2025 without just hoping and banking? Because hope is not a plan, right? It's going to have to be competition. Competition is going to have to be the catalyst for this wide receiver group. We saw it on the 2023 team, not only at the receiver position, but the Packers roster in general. And Gutekunst has talked about it. A big part of the development, the growth that group had in 2023 as a whole was because of competition. And looking at the receiver room specifically that year, you had Christian Watson, you had Romeo Doubs returning. You added to the mix Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Malik Heath. I think the Packers are going to have to try to replicate that competition where it's, back to taking a step back to take two steps forward, right? All right, playing time, you guys have had good years, you've got NFL experience, but this playing time is going to have to be earned moving forward. These opportunities in these high leverage situations are going to have to be re-earned moving forward because we're adding some new players to the mix in the draft, whether it's a early round pick and a mid round pick, however the Packers want to go about it. But that competition is going to have to be the catalyst, and hopefully by infusing some additional talent into the room, the Packers are then able to increase that urgency that Brian Gutekunst talked about, and you hope that those elements then lead to improved play. Now, is this a foolproof plan? Absolutely not. But in terms of how does this group get better, like I said, outside of just hoping that the players on the roster take a step forward, I think this is what the Packers' clearest path to improve play is. You add some competition to the mix and hope that increases the urgency and the level of play overall. And like I said, I would expect that from the draft versus free agency, especially with what's left. There's a lot of players out there in free agency who have produced at high level at the NFL. But again, where they're at in their careers does not align with how Brian Gutekunst goes about building his roster. And when it comes to the defensive line position, I really think it's a similar conversation as receiver. Let's weigh what the two options were. Going out, spending a decent chunk of salary cap space to bring in an established veteran pass rusher, or option two, you go to the draft, which, by the way, has a ton, and I mean a ton of talent at the defensive line position this season for the Packers to choose from. There's going to be some high-end talent probably on the Packers' big board when they're picking in the clock, not just in round one, but in rounds 2 and 3 as well. So again, that veteran you're spending salary cap space on to bring in, to sign during free agency, or a talented, high-end, young, ascending player on a rookie deal. Which of those options sounds more like what path Brian Gutekunst wants to go down, right? It's the draft. And again, not saying right or wrong, not saying that's how it should be, but looking at how the Packers operate, that was always going to be the clearest path towards the Green Bay Packers adding and bolstering their pass rush, which Brian Gutekunst admits has to get better. If they're going to accomplish their goals this season, as he said at the Combine, the pass rush has to improve. And when it comes to the free agent market, this is already a group that has the defensive line that has a significant amount of cap space, dollars, devoted to it. You have Rashawn Gary's contract. You have Kenny Clark's contract. You have Devontae Wyatt coming up on his final year of his rookie deal, and a decision to be made about his fifth-year option, right? There's a lot of dollars already devoted there. So just from a resource standpoint, if you're the Green Bay Packers and trying to allocate cap dollars throughout the roster to make sure you're building a well-rounded team, you already have a lot there. So again, I always felt that the draft was going to be the Packers' best avenue when it came to trying to bolster that pass rush. And as we look at who's left on the free agent market, Dante Fowler is still out there, someone who was highly productive last season, but similarly to the wide receiver position, right? These are established rooms. This isn't like cornerback where, as we talked about, it always made sense that that was going to be the position where Gutekunst took a swing in free agency, right? Because you had Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine. We don't know what's happening with Jair, and then a ton of inexperienced players behind them. That's not the case at wide receiver or defensive line. You have Romeo Doubs, Dontavian Wicks, Jaden Reed. Defensive line, we talked about. You have Rashawn Gary, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, Lucas Van Ness, Carl Brooks, right? You have these established players there that give you a strong foundation. You just need more production from them. And ideally, in a perfect world, the Packers are hoping that a lot of these players on the roster at both of those positions are the ones who take that step forward this year to improve the play of both of those position groups. So I say all that to say this. Adding a mid-round pick or a middle-tier free agent signing, I don't know that moves the needle for either of those position groups. They both have a lot of solid players. What they need is that high-end impact presence. And I think the greatest opportunity for the Packers to add that to the mix was going to come in the NFL draft, especially, like I said, given how much talent there is at that position group this year. So there you have it, my friends. As always, I really appreciate you tuning in. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work over at ESPNLacrosse.com and download the 1055 ESPN Lacrosse app. Till next time, friends, take care.